All right, Christian, nice to see you this morning.
Morning.
Today we're going to do our first ever Risk 360 webinar, and we're going to talk about security for healthcare technology companies, especially companies earlier on in their life cycle, newer companies, high growth companies.
Yeah, sounds
So,
great.
cool.
Now you have an accompanying white paper that we'll provide everybody after the webinar. They can read, and we'll talk about what we talk about here today too. So you want to maybe do quick intros just so people know who we are?
Yep, let's go for it. So I'm Shane Peden. I'm the director of the Cyber Risk and CISO Advisory Practice at Risk 360. And Christian?
Yep, I'm Christian Hyde. I'm managing director at Risk 360. I'm also the co-founder of Risk 360. And Shane and I think you gave me a stat ahead of the call, and I think something like 25% of our customers and clients fall in the category of, if not healthcare startup, then some type of healthcare technology company. So I guess we have a fair amount of experience in this and kind of how it's relevant. And Shane, you're kind of the acting CISO for a lot of these organizations. So that's probably relevant for, for the audience. You want to talk a little bit about that before we hop in, just kind of what you do for those companies?
Yeah, so a lot of our clients, as I mentioned, being more of startups or funded organizations and higher growth technology firms, a lot of times they'll be starting out their journey, they've built a great solution, but now they have to deal with the realities that all of their customers are demanding HIPAA compliance and other forms of information security and privacy compliance. And where to begin? Because there's a lot to bite off. And if you read HIPAA, it's very intimidating. It's a long law. It has a daunting reputation in the market. And it's one of the most visible regulations where people actually get in trouble and get fined for it. You may end up in the news for it. So it's a big deal, and getting your arms around it can be pretty hard sometimes.
Yeah, it's a strange marketplace because I think the phenomena today is that even the startup companies that typically wouldn't have to worry about security, or at least not compliance so early in their journey, can't even enter the market or do business with another healthcare company without evidencing they have a minimum standard of security and compliance, especially HIPAA, like you mentioned. So if I'm, ABC startup company and I want to do business with a healthcare conglomerate, provide them some kind of SaaS service, they're not even going to think about doing business unless you can prove out that you have a basic level of security and that you're HIPAA compliant. So it's strange to see. I think we have at least one customer, maybe more, that is literally in startup pre-revenue mode, can't even have their first clients until they can demonstrate HIPAA compliance. So they brought us on to do that. And then you have the megacorps that we also work with that need full-blown enterprise programs. So it's really, I think, in healthcare and healthcare IT, this might be the only market that starts from day one all the way to day 100 or year 100 of the organization that security and compliance relevant for.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and we'll break down what we're going to talk through. So we're working through the background right now. We're going to structure this talk from the perspective of a new company or a company that's relatively young in its journey, because HIPAA compliance is always a struggle. Christian mentioned we work with some teams that are multinational organizations that still worry about HIPAA compliance. But for the small company, we wanted to talk about the balance of building a program versus just making it. So we'll work through MVP development. How would you think of an MVP, Christian?
Yeah, I kind of think of that like, if you don't know what MVP is, it stands for minimum viable product. This is that pre-revenue startup company that they're really focused on product. They're bringing something to market. So the question is, how do I build in security and compliance from the get-go so I can get traction with those early companies? So this is the day zero company. So thinking about that, what's the right size program for them? That's kind of how I think about MVP development.
Yeah, and then from there we'll start talking about what it's like when you're getting funding, onboarding new customers. What are the expectations? What have we seen some of our clients that are going through this deal with? What are some of the struggles they have? And then we'll dive into what you need to be thinking about as you get traction and you start to scale the business, and all the cost and benefit between the different the different choices that you can make for the business. Because bottom line, the law will say, hey, you need to be 100% compliant from day one. Customers will say they have that expectation, but compliance can't cost more than your profit, or you won't have a business, right? So you've
Yep.
got to, there's always trade-offs.
Yep. So we gave a little bit of background already, but I think it's important to emphasize this, kind of why this matters. And so the whole phenomenon in the marketplace has been, if you're a healthcare startup or technology-oriented business, a SaaS solution, you want to do business with larger businesses. Presumably, they're outsourcing some business process to you, whatever that might be. And the healthcare companies are extremely conservative because they can't afford a data breach. So they're a little bit hesitant to do business with small companies sometimes. So the question these healthcare companies often ask is, how do I know that you, a new technology company, aren't going to put me at risk? And then I have to notify my customers and my patients that we had a breach. And HHS comes down on these healthcare companies and audits them. So that's what we're seeing. It's like it's a chain. The regulatory bodies impact the healthcare companies. The healthcare companies then hold the SaaS companies accountable and will not do business with them unless they can prove out that they have a minimum compliance, program. So, like we said earlier, from basically day zero, when you're trying to acquire your first company, sometimes you can't even do trials with companies and give away your software unless you have a HIPAA program or at least a security and compliance program to speak to.
Yeah.
And kind of with that graph on the right, what we've seen in the marketplace is HHS, basically since the early 2000s has been more and more aggressive on the number of cases that they decide to investigate. So you can see they're up in the 40,000 range now. So you imagine 40,000 investigations, that's 40,000 companies that are now taking HIPAA security and compliance very seriously, and thereby pushing those requirements down on their SaaS vendors. And now you're a startup that can't even do business in the marketplace without having a baseline security program. So I guess the overall theme is we want to help those companies from startup all the way to, mature organizations build that program so you can, bottom line, protect the data, have a great world-class security program, but also sell into those businesses that you want to sell into. Any background that you want to add, Shane?
No, one thing that you would probably hear is actually OCR, Office for Civil Rights. I don't know how all the regulatory agencies meld together exactly, but I believe it's the Office for Civil Rights, the OCR, that actually initiates those audits. And I've heard that OCR is one of the only agencies within the government, or one of the very few that's completely self-funded by the fines that they basically lean on to the subjects that they're auditing.
So they do so many audits that they can fund themselves?
Yeah, they basically fund themselves through audits and fines for HIPAA breaches. And another thing to note too, that's just an interesting fact I didn't know, is the OCR is largely, the audits are largely delivered by private organizations. So, so it's a tough place to be in. Like, you don't want to mess around with HIPAA, is how I see it, because you're basically going to get a professional auditor who has a vested interest in doing a really good audit and finding ways to, enforce the law effectively, because it essentially funds themselves.
Sure.
Yeah,
that's good background. Yeah, so let's dive in here. So starting in like the minimum viable product stage. So there's probably some folks who have startup companies who are begrudgingly building out a security and compliance program when they're trying to, build their company. I know we talked about this. This is in our white paper if anybody wants to reference that after. And I think what me and you, Shane, discussed was the number one thing that a brand new company really needs to focus on is not security and compliance. It's in fact, product market fit. Because if you don't have a product that the market wants, you can be the most secure company in the world. You're still not going to sell into it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that friction. This new R&D, new development, making sure that the healthcare company actually benefits from what you're creating and wants that product. And then when you know that, then you can think about security and compliance. But having said that, I know you identified a handful of things that from the get-go, day zero, that companies can do that's a pretty low lift, isn't going to burden the company to kind of build in security and compliance from the beginning. So you want to talk about some of those things, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to how savvy the entrepreneur is and how well they know the market they're playing in.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, you'd hope if you're an entrepreneur, you go out, you build a product, and you want to build it for whatever industry, you know that industry. So if you're the entrepreneur in the healthcare IT space, and you know you're going to be dealing with HIPAA, you know you're going to be dealing with PCI or any of these other regulatory or compliance frameworks, start thinking early on, how do I build the platform from the bottom up with solutions that are going to get me there? The biggest and simplest thing you can do is only use platforms that you can sign a business associates agreement with. So you know, do your platforms have HIPAA compliant offerings?
So let me ask you this, Shane. So I'm an entrepreneur, you know, I'm a great business person. I understand the healthcare marketplace, you know, and I'm probably going to hire a CTO or partner with a CTO or maybe even outsource my development. Like what platform should I be considering? Like what are the ones that if I'm trying to coach my technology team in the right direction, should I be pointing them in one direction or another? Are there platforms I should be using? What would you advise on that?
I think it's twofold. Where do you find the intersection between where you can find talent that knows those platforms and can build on them and get the agility you need for whatever it is that you're building?
So you don't want to build on an obscure platform, is what you're saying, something that no one knows how to do. You can't find talent.
And I wouldn't want to name any by name just to, you know, it just seems in bad form. But there are some platforms that most people just don't know anymore. I guess I could say if you use some older language, like, I don't know, if we're just being funny, COBOL. Like, COBOL may be or COBOL, I'm sorry, it's not a color. That may be a perfectly fine language, but who knows it anymore, right? Yeah. So it's kind of like picking that intersection between where you can go to the talent pool and find developers and engineers that really like it, but do they also have a HIPAA compliant offering? AWS, GCP, and Azure, those are all three that check those boxes, you know, and people know those, you know.
Yeah, I know those are the biggest, and you know, they have a lot of tack-ons. I think all three of those have HIPAA compliant environments. They also have you know, almost endless tools that you can tack on naturally, like, you know, right with a click of a button, you can add on monitoring or encryption for a lot of those platforms. So I know that's kind of an advantage of the modern technology environment and new startups starting up today versus, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, is this whole cloud ecosystem. So, I mean, in short, if someone's using AWS, Google Cloud Platform, or Microsoft Azure, are those good choices in your mind as a place to start?
Yeah, I think that they're great. I just avoid trying to roll my own anything. You know, I try to only build, just me personally and the experience I have, I'd only try to rely on well-adopted open source libraries that have been heavily vetted, you know, highly adopted and widely used platforms like AWS and Google Cloud, you know, things like that. And then at least you have somewhere to build off of, and it's not going to be a mega headache to get HIPAA compliant, because we have seen clients that had traditional on-prem infrastructure, and it'd be really difficult to say, yes, we are, you know, compliant with whatever it is we need to be compliant with. But because of how they were set up, it was really difficult and expensive to get there versus being able to go to a service provider and just kind of pass that through to them and let them take on that burden.
So if we're talking to a startup company, it's probably a conversation like, hey, pick one of the big platforms. There's a lot of talent out there that can develop in those platforms, that know how to manage that infrastructure. And then add the tack-ons that those platforms provide, at least in the short term, because that's low-hanging fruit. You keep you moving forward. And then whatever you do choose, try to choose the HIPAA compliant version of that platform, because most big providers have a, you know, something that says, hey, choose the HIPAA compliant version of this, and that'll be like a good place to start, you know. And from our experience too, Shane, correct me if you have different thoughts here, but I think that makes the big companies, like the healthcare conglomerates that you're trying to do work with, feel better too. If you can say, hey, I built this on top of AWS or Azure or whatever, and I have the HIPAA compliant solution, and I clicked all the configuration settings that say HIPAA compliant. From an MVP perspective, when you don't have a lot of time or a huge team to manage compliance, I think that's a strong story to tell at that stage. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, in fact, I think at the younger stages of the company, it's important to be telling a strong story, even before maybe you have everything as technically sound as you would like it to be, or your processes. Even if you can paint a roadmap of where we are going, or hey, here's our policies, or our procedures, or here's management's intent. If you're not even 100% there because it's just not realistic yet, I think telling the story is just as important as actually doing it.
Yep.
Because you've got to build that confidence.
Yeah, I know there's this whole phenomena of like vendor security questionnaires that a lot of these startup companies get. And one of the things that, me and you, Shane, always do for clients is create like a vendor transparency package where you get ahead of all those questionnaires or the anticipated questions from the healthcare companies and try to build out and tell, like you said, tell your story. Hey, this is how we're handling HIPAA. Here's how here's a summary of our security program. Hey, we encrypt data at transit and rest. We can, we have retention configured, just so you can get ahead of that, all those tough questions that the security guy at the company is going to be asking. And I think that also makes you look pretty good if you're a healthcare startup, because it says, hey, I'm being very pragmatic about this. I'm thinking about it. And hey, I already have a story around that. And that shows a different level of maturity rather than getting caught in the phone call and not having answers to anything, which makes you look bad.
Yeah. And then we have a few other requirements down here. We've been hitting the technical really hard, but then also change management, privacy, and the HIPAA specific stuff, or if you're dealing with PCI, or if you're dealing with fair credit reporting, knowing the answers to those questions before, even if you're not doing it yet. Let's talk about change management real quick, though. This is something I see become a real challenge for companies, and it's so what happens is you're a new team. You may have a sole developer. You may have a CTO that's a technical genius, and you just build this product. You build your MVP, but they just build it however they build it. They're just kind of pushing things straight into production. They're not doing a lot of testing or QA on the back end. They're the guys that live solely in the platform, so they're not really documenting their code well. They're not really doing, a real great job of following all the rules of code development, using their source code repos effectively, et cetera. Even things that are even more serious, like they're putting API keys and secrets directly in source code or web configs, all of that.
Yeah.
And then the day comes that the MVP is, considered, hey, we made it, time to scale, let's hire more developers. And you're in trouble because you've been so sloppy with how you're managing everything that it's really hard to change those old bad habits. And you've got a lot of tribal knowledge concentrated just into one or two people. And there's no real effective way to communicate those processes to new teammates as they onboard. So that's practically really tough. But then from a compliance perspective, that's a huge no-no. Like that's actually a really big deal also to all these compliance requirements.
Yeah, I guess there's this healthy friction between trying to move fast and then formalizing things. And the young startup always errs on the side of being fast and lack documentation and lack formality. And for those folks, maybe this is an entrepreneur that isn't familiar with the change management process, that's a pretty structured process in a secure and a compliant environment. You have dedicated testing environments, you have quality assurance checks, you have documentation for every change, you have a formal push to the production environment. Whereas if you're a 1 or 2 man shop developing a product, it's probably that same person doing every step, maybe skipping steps, and certainly moving quickly. And that's kind of the advantage of an agile small company where 1 or 2 people are doing everything. But at the end of the day, like you said, that's not scalable. You can't have 20 developers doing that. And also, if you start having a security person at a healthcare company asking questions, that's going to make them feel very uncomfortable. Yeah. So you got to formalize that. And I think another thing for that is I think the small company always lacks policy. Policies almost seem silly. It's like, why would I, it just feels like a check the box thing. I have to have policies. I don't want to do that. But that's regardless of what you're dealing with. It could be a SOC 2 report, it could be HIPAA, it could be PCI. Every framework requires policies. So it's like that might actually be a decent place to start, even if your policy is very simple, because it helps management state their intent, articulate what their expectations are as far as a process. And then when you hire you get funding and you hire your next few people, you have a policy to point to. You also have a policy to point to when that compliance person, a security company, security person at the company you're trying to work with asks questions. And that ties into change management too, just writing stuff down.
Yeah. And I've actually got a real life story I can share about this. We had a startup customer that was only, 5 or 6 people. And one of the first things I told him is, hey, we need to get an employee onboarding process in place. And at the time, everybody that was part of the business were just investors. None of them were actually employees. They're like, well, who would we even have this for? And I was really insistent on it. And then they brought on a few contractors. Like, we need to run them through it. We need to background check them. We need to do X, Y, Z.
Yep.
And then eventually they started getting some real traction. They ended up bringing in another company. They ended up needing to bring on more developers. And then they had a big customer come to them and was really concerned about HIPAA and their processes over how they vet employees. So it was just inevitable. Like from day one, I was telling them, it's like, this is going to come up, I promise.
Yeah, it comes up fast too.
It
Like
come
basically
up
your first
fast.
customer.
Yeah, it was their first customer. And it was a small customer, and even the small customer cared.
Yep.
So
and then
it
if
was
it's too
great
late,
we had it.
Yeah, exactly. You can't retroactively do that stuff. You got to be able to point back to it up front.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Cool.
What about like just some specific HIPAA stuff before we move on to like getting traction? Like what are 2 or 3 things in your mind that's like, hey, look, this is a technical requirement. It's hard to back into that. You need to do it from day one. Are there any on your mind that the company should be thinking about?
Yeah, and actually in the white paper that accompanies this, which is completely free. We're not trying to sell anything. So if you're watching,
we'll put a link to the white paper in the notes or whatever for this video, so everybody can download that.
We actually have got a pretty good detailed list that I'm looking at that we come up with for all of these bullet points. But HIPAA specific business associates agreements are a really big deal. BAAs can be tricky, and I would really recommend if you can find a trusted advisor or a lawyer that specializes in HIPAA, it may be worth paying them for a few hours of their time to get a good template in place.
Can you just talk about what a BAA is for those who might not know?
Yeah, thanks. Business Associates Agreement is kind of a confidentiality agreement that's prescribed by law, by the HIPAA law.
Yep. It basically came out of HIPAA 2.0, which was called was it high tech, I think, and then it pretty much prescribed that you had to have an agreement between any business associate.
Yeah. So in the world of HIPAA and healthcare, you have this idea of a covered entity and a business associate. And I would say in layman's terms, without getting too technical, covered entity is like the healthcare provider, the health insurance provider. It's sort of the originator of the healthcare data, and ultimately, I don't know if owner is the right word, but maybe custodian. And then the business associate is any subservice organization that you're going to pass that data through to do services on your part or on your behalf.
The bottom line is, in addition to any contracts you're signing, any master service agreements or money changing hands, there's this other piece of documentation that as a healthcare startup, you're going to have to sign with your customers, and you're going to have to sign with any vendors that you use. So you want to try to make that document legally sound. So that's why I think Shane's advising, get a lawyer and adopt a BAA, because that's day zero.
And I can tell you, this is why I think lawyers are really valuable in this case. The things that you're going to see bite you in a BAA, just real quickly, because we're going long on this slide, you'll see yourself getting bit on how quickly you're obligated to notify them of security breaches. You'll see strong language around what a security breach actually is at times, and you may not want that to be as explicit. You might see requirements that you have to buy certain types of insurance that is very costly to the organization. You'll see things on limits of liability that might be scary to you. You may even see you'll see security requirements in there at times, and sometimes they may want you to do things that you're just like, We can't do that. We're just not even mature enough. Like you may see them say, hey, I want you to do a SOC 2 report. They're like, over what? Like, we're three guys. I can't go get a SOC 2 report. That's like prohibitively expensive. So you really got to read those and make sure that it's right size. The other things, HIPAA breach notification processes are a really big deal because those are baked into the law. You really got to have processes around that. Also, because your BAA is probably going to have to define some requirements. You need to make sure your policies align to those contractual requirements. Yep. The other is determine if you'll need to obtain informed consent from patients for providing your services. This may be if you're in the clinical space and you're doing research, you're doing trials on behalf of a customer. We've only had a few clients that actually need this, but it was one that kind of hit me as a shock the first time I ever ran into it. I was like, I didn't realize that there was a whole section of law over informed consent. And then the last one I had here was making sure you're doing retention on any PHI related transactions for at least 6 years. That even includes application transactions that may not have any PHI in them.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you got,
sorry.
Just a quick summary. I guess you got BAAs, make sure that's sound. Make sure you got your breach notification down. So if you have a security breach, what do you do? And then you have, I guess, encryption at rest, encryption in transit, that always comes up, and then data retention. Yep. So those are kind of like your maybe 3-4 things to do if you're that MVP.
Yeah, that's like the quick must-have first couple things. Yeah.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about. All right, I have my MVP down. I'm getting traction now. I got a few customers. I even have maybe I'm getting investment at this point, and I'm at the next stage of maturity. So what are some of the things that you think, Shane, a company should start thinking about at that point?
This is where Risk 360, our team usually likes to start building our vendor transparency report. Mm-hmm. So I just mentioned earlier the whole idea of maybe a customer wants you to have a SOC 2 report and you're too young to do that, it's too expensive. Let's give them something to placate them before you're at a point where you want to go do a big compliance certification. We've started building vendor transparency reports that'll have a nice narrative of what the company, like first off, what do you do? So it's kind of a brag sheet of what your services are. And then we start getting into the nitty gritty of, hey, what are our policies today? What are our policies going to be tomorrow? We may not necessarily say what will our policies be down the road, but we'll write it in such a way that it's aspirational. This is what we aspire to as a company. Here's how we really care and how we're good stewards of your data, the privacy of the customer, how we're meeting HIPAA's requirements. Yep. And then at the end of it, we'll put together a really nice, usually it's based on ISO 27001, a really nice grid of all control requirements and how we're aligning with those today.
Yeah. So basically a document that's shortening the sales cycle, if you will, because at this point, you're probably getting some volume of interest and you still don't have a huge team. So you got to somehow reduce the burden of all of that due diligence activity. And that's the vendor due diligence package. The other thing, Shane, I think at this point, what we see is a lot of companies start getting vulnerability scans and penetration tests. So you might be a 10-person company or less, and you're already getting pen tests because that is a very common, it's a good maturity point to kind of sanity check your application security. Two, I think that's the piece of documentation that might get you over the edge for a healthcare company. They'll say, okay, I understand that you can't get a $20, $30, $40, $50,000, SOC 2 or ISO certification, but at least get a pen test and, show me some policy. So I think third-party assessments, that's when that starts really becoming relevant and a good purchase.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a few technical security requirements you need to start doing too, the pen tests and vulnerability scans. But now is a great time to start turning on MFA, multi-factor, if you're able to. Turn it on everywhere. I also had a note here, implement media reuse and disposal policy. We're coming up with these recommendations based purely on experience. This is the stuff that customers start to really care about, and they'll ask about it in one-off. So you'll just be in a phone call. They're like, hey, what are you doing for encryption? How do you ensure data is encrypted in transit? Do you have MFA turned on? Like, there's just certain things that you see over and over again. So usually we're trying to get the teams we work with kind of building up along the way, not hit you all at once with everything and just make life miserable, but just keep building block. And as a company matures, just be tacking it on or building it in as you go along so that you don't get caught flat-footed. And I was going to say SDLC too. Now, once you get early clients, you need to lock in your systems development lifecycle, your change management processes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of business problems too, just to think about. So if you're thinking about funding at this point, I think a savvy investor or equity group or venture capital firm, if they know that you're in the healthcare space, they know about HIPAA. Like they know that this is going to be an issue. So I think you need to have a story to tell there. So even from forget the customers, think about just venture funding. I think you got to have a minimum story there. Say, hey, look, this is how we're handling HIPAA. This is the steps we're taking. Here's the stuff we do. At least so you can, present some confidence and show the investors that you're thinking about that. Typically, I don't think investors are going to get down in the weeds. They're not going to ask about clauses or anything like that, but they want to know that you know. So that's important. And then from a client perspective, as you're out there selling, again, you got to have that nailed. You got to have your BAs ready to go. You got to have your third parties managed. You got to have policies in place. I mean, I don't think you're going to get very far in the stage acquiring companies without a program.
Yeah.
Shane, can you talk about, I think everybody's kind of waiting for, what tools do I buy or what do I do? Are there some, I know we talked about AWS, Azure. Are there things that are low-hanging fruit here that folks should maybe start considering to integrate into their program?
Man, that's so dependent on what solution you're building. Maybe take
AWS or something. I know you did another webinar on securing AWS. So probably 50% or more of the folks watching this are going to be on that. Are there a few tack-ons or something like that?
Yeah. So here's how I'd engineer it. I definitely turn on CloudWatch, which is logging. I'd start thinking about how I'm configuring. Man, this may be too technical. Stop me if I go.
No, I think people want this. Yeah, give it.
All right, here's what I would do straight up. And you guys can email us if you're watching and I go over your head, you want to know more. I'd probably run an AWS configuration scan on whatever I have, and then I would fix everything that comes up.
So like an inspector scan?
Inspector may be a good one. There's a few open source tools. One is called Scout 2, and another is called Prowler. And it'll look at your AWS environment, and it'll return all of these red flags. And they're not necessarily vulnerabilities. It's more like, hey, here's something that is typically not good. And it may be logging is not enabled. You don't have sufficient protection or access controls on the logs. It may be that ingress and egress traffic to your virtual networks is not configured right, or your virtual compute, which is called EC2 in AWS.
So it'll just give you a list of stuff to fix, right? Is that the bottom line? It'll kind of give you a list of configurations that you should consider.
It's not even fix. It's more like that's where a guy like me would go to an engineer and be like, hey, we need to talk about this, and I need to understand what it is you guys are doing, and then we would find stuff to fix.
So if I'm a CEO, I'll say, hey, run one of those tools that you just told me, give me that report, and at least that can be a source of conversation. Hey, tell me how we're dealing with these. I see these red flags.
Yeah, and that's a great early kind of technical risk assessment, because born out of that, we're gonna create an after action report. We're gonna track it through, and then now if we ever did have to demonstrate that we're doing technical vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, whatever, I would produce that as an artifact. I'd say, yeah, this is what we're doing at this stage in the company as a risk assessment.
Yep.
The other thing too that we didn't mention, at this stage in the company's life, you need to have a point person for security and compliance. You need to have somebody formally defined as being responsible for it within the company. And that's actually baked into the law. So I think you get customers, you need to have somebody that is responsible within the company. Yeah.
Cool. Any other big stuff, Shane, at this stage you think you should point out, or should we move on to kind of let you have traction?
No, let's go for it. We'll move on.
All right. So I guess moving on in our life cycle here, you've gotten funding or you've gotten enough customers where you're at scale now. You're really cranking along here, and you need a real program. You're acquiring clients. You're way past the first few clients, and now we've got to build a real program. I guess you could say we got to dot all the I's, cross all the T's, and really do this thing. So Shane, you want to kind of talk about like the key elements that we have on the screen here of like what does a real program look like?
Yes, so the first one that I always like to do is pick a framework and own it. Base your policies off of it, base your risk management system off of it. We really love ISO 27001. In fact, we have teammate, our head of research, Phil Brudney. I asked him recently, said, hey man, could you map HIPAA to ISO? Because I was trying to do an assessment for a company against the NIST framework that is built for implementing HIPAA. And as I'm reading through it in hyper detail, I'm like, man, this all sounds so familiar. It sounds just like ISO 27001. And Phil went and mapped it for me, and there was actually like 100% coverage. So we always like to say, hey, do ISO 27001. I know 853 is also popular. I know that's a United States developed, federal government approved information risk management and control framework, but 853 is so in the weeds. I feel like 27001 is a vastly superior fit for younger startup companies that are not dealing with big government agencies as their customers.
I guess the bottom line is though, just pick a framework, whatever you're comfortable with, because there might be some NIST folks that are like super comfortable with that one. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really matter. They're going to get the job done as long as you do a good job. So pick a framework, kind of stick to it, build your policies off that, use that as your roadmap, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then current state assessment, we talked about this already, right? Like you could say we start with that technical assessment of your production environment. Well, you probably just completed, maybe a third of ISO by doing that if you resolve all those issues.
Yeah.
So
the bottom line is identify gaps, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think this is kind of our life cycle too. We usually choose a framework. We're kind of an ISO shop, but NIST is good too, whatever your flavor is. And then do a true assessment against yourself based on that assessment. And it probably should be someone obviously competent enough to do that assessment because some of it's in the weeds. Because at the end of the day, you're going to get a report and you're going to have gaps in your program. You're going to say, here are all the requirements. Here's the 150 things that framework says to do. We're doing 50 of them. We're not doing these 100 of them. And we got to get a program in place to resolve those to build out a true program. So that current state assessment, in my mind, is pretty important because that tells you where you are today and where you need to go and helps you build out a strategic roadmap to get there.
Yeah, and I think something important to communicate is that that current state assessment, it's okay to have gaps. You're not trying to pass it because there is no pass fail here. This is for your eyes only.
Yeah, there's also this myth that I think we're better off not knowing about it. Like I've heard that before. It's like, people feel like if I know about it and don't do anything about it, I'm going to be in more trouble than if I just didn't know about it. But there's laws in the books. Like this has been litigated. So HIPAA is a weird phenomenon because a lot of the rulings are based on law. It was, some kind of jurisprudence that came down after a court case, and that's how everyone adopted. And what's been largely adopted is this idea of the reasonableness test. If you had a reasonable security program in place, would you be liable? So it doesn't mandate that you have to know about it or not know about it. So if you're just ignorant of the facts, that doesn't protect you from a legal perspective. So do your current state assessment, be truthful and honest, and get everything out there on the table, because it doesn't matter if you know about it or you don't know about it. It's better that you know about it so you can do something about it. Just want to throw that out there because we hear all the time. It's like, I think there's some apprehension, like almost I would be safer if I didn't know, but that's just not the case.
No, I agree 100%. And the next one is get that risk council in place, governance and leadership.
Yep.
By law, I keep saying that because this is one of the few compliance frameworks we work with where I say, hey man, this is by law. The federal government is behind this. By law, you have to have somebody in charge of security and privacy at the organization.
Yeah, you can't abdicate your responsibility. You can't be a CEO and say, hey, I didn't know about that. Yeah. It's truly leadership has to be involved, bought in, and show participation in the security program.
Yeah. So we suggest an IRC, a risk governance team.
Which the Information Risk Council is what we call that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a cross-functional team. It's not siloed. If you're going for ISO certification, something I love about ISO is it pays attention to whether or not the program is siloed. So you need to make it cross-functional. At our clients that do the best job at this, we have the CTO at the CEO, general counsel, somebody over operations, somebody over sales and customer success, and then enterprise IT and DevOps.
Yeah.
So we literally cover the organization.
Yeah, and just point out here that like, hey, this isn't intended to be burdensome. This isn't intended to be some meeting for the sake of having meetings. This is actually going to save you time. Because if you're a CEO and you're like, I don't have time to participate at this level in security, like, no, this is like you're there for 30 minutes. You should have your people giving you key performance indicators so you can manage the program and take action. If they're not doing that, if it's devolving into conversations and discussions, that's not the intent. Like a CEO has stuff to do. They should be at the meeting, get the report, know what's important, and be able to take action. And that's the spirit of a governance and an information risk council.
Yeah, exactly. Usually this is kind of like we boil up decision points. And I'm usually trying to make as many decisions as I can as the visa, so before I even get it there. So a lot of things I may not even take them because I feel comfortable just taking the lead on it and doing it, and I'll just tell them how it turned out. But if there's like spend associated with it, if it's something that impacts multiple lines of business, if it's something just really risky, yeah, it gets in front of the IRC.
Yep. So talk a little bit about policies and procedures, because I know that's an exercise that I think people roll their eyes out and they're like, okay, we're going to have these documents that live in a file repository and never reads. But what's your take on policies and procedures?
If you're in a healthcare space, I think your policy should always reflect reality. We actually have this discussion internally every now and then in our team. Should a policy be aspirational? Should it just be by the book? Should I just adopt a policy that I know is going to make an auditor happy? Or should it be what I actually do every day? Mm-hmm. I think you ought to know what's required of you by law, communicate that, start building that in a policy, and then make sure that you enforce it. But if you have a policy that you never intend to actually do, enforce, or adhere to, don't write it down, because if you ever have an issue, you're going to get audited against your risk assessments and your policies.
Yeah,
so
that's an important point. You're typically audited against your own policies, because it's really easy for an auditor to walk in that's from the HHS and say, hey, look, your policy says this, you're out of compliance with your own policy. Yeah. And that makes you look pretty bad. The other thing I'll say about policies and procedures for me is, like, I always say this phrase, the policy is the written articulation of management's intent. So you're putting on paper, you're forcing yourself to articulate what your expectations are for the group. And that helps you as a leader put your strategy down on paper, train people on that strategy, and hold people accountable to that strategy. So I always take them a little bit more seriously and try to get those thoughts on paper. So, you could say, hey, look, world, hey, company that I'm building, this is what I expect of you guys and why. And that's an important piece for me.
Yeah.
So technical considerations, like what's the checklist? Is there a checklist that lives somewhere? I know people always want a checklist.
I'm going through the white paper to see if I had anything here. Man, this is so dependent on the team at this point in the life cycle. I mean, I think the technical considerations at this point is the big ones are: do you have effective monitoring? Do you have effective vulnerability management? Vulnerability management, not just scanning it, but doing something about it.
Like patching your systems. Yeah.
And having internal SLAs that you adhere to. I mean, you're getting pretty well buttoned up at this point.
So if I'm a CEO, I'm thinking, okay, all right, technical stuff. Tell me how we encrypt data at rest and in transit. Tell me what we use to scan our platform, and how do I know that you're fixing anything that comes up, so you're patching it.
Yeah.
What else did you say there, Shane? There's a couple others.
I'd even say this is where you really need to know who has access to what. If you're in healthcare, you should really be doing data flows at this point. You need to know where PHI is flowing through the organization. Anywhere that PHI touches is in scope for HIPAA. If it hits a SaaS app, that's in scope. If it hits a laptop, that's in scope. If it's on a server, that's in scope. So you got to know where PHI is, who has access to it, all the apps that go through it. We have a pretty cool risk assessment breakdown that consists of about, what, 5 or 6 sub-projects?
Yep.
And in every sub-project that we do, every risk assessment we do, we're thinking about data flow, not just for HIPAA or PHI, but also for PCI data, PII, just sensitive information, confidential information, and then that builds data classification policies, and then you build your logical access off
Yep.
of those classifications and so on.
Yeah. So based on the words you're saying, Shane, if I'm a CEO, I'm thinking, okay, I need a professional. Like, this isn't something I'm going to blow up a pickup and just do. Because, I mean, data classification, data flow diagrams, configuration settings, picking the right tools for the business. I mean, and we're kind of echoing this. I mean, you have traction at this point. You really need a professional in your organization, somebody who can manage this program. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
tell me
exactly.
about recurring activities. So I think there's this myth that I do it once and I'm done. I never have to think about it. But in reality, like, this is the new normal. Like, you got to maintain a program. There's going to be meetings every quarter, every month. There's stuff that you do every single year. Can you kind of rattle off, like, what is the cadences that I need to be thinking about if I'm an organization?
Yeah, this is where, if you align to a risk management framework, this is where you go through and you start picking out all of the controls that are not automated, I guess. And you have to actually put it on the calendar and make sure it gets done, or make
Yeah.
sure that it's part of somebody's job responsibilities. Like, we had a client yesterday we were talking to. We got to the part of ISO because we're doing an internal audit with them, and it was over monitoring.
Sure.
And we were like, well, how often do you monitor logs? And luckily the client said something really positive. Oh, we got 3 guys, that's all they do. They're like,
Yep.
we just monitor logs all day. I was like, well, awesome.
Yeah.
But some teams never think about it. It's like, oh, I'm monitoring, I'm good. All right, well, how are you reporting on it? How are you alerting on it? How do you benchmark against it?
Yeah. So I'm thinking, there's other stuff too. It's like, all right, think about annual activities. Every year you're going to do an annual risk assessment. Every year you're going to do, annual penetration test, at least annual. Every year you're going to refresh your policies, at least annually. So that's like annual stuff. Quarterly, every quarter you're going to do user access reviews. Every quarter you're going to do information risk council meetings. And then you got your monthly stuff. You have like a leadership team meeting every month. You're going to do spot checks on stuff every month. And then you have your automated stuff, or automated logs, automated configuration setting checks, stuff like that. So there's probably a list. And I know when we manage a program, Shane, we're making lists of this and assigning it out to folks because we want to make sure that someone's accountable for it. It's measurable. We can report those KPIs back up to leadership. But if I'm a CEO or a CTO, I'm thinking about those reoccurring cadences because I want to make sure they're happening. I want to make sure someone owns them. And also if someone turns over, like, John Doe owns 150 things. John leaves the company and we hire Jane. Well, Jane needs to take up those reoccurring activities. And the only way that she's going to know that she needs to take those on is if you have a good list of them and you can reassign them out and they're part of those job duties. So you have continuity of the program. So if I'm a CEO, I'm asking my CISO or my team that's managing that. It's like, hey, what's the recurring activities? What's the body of work that I need to manage? And that's important for the continuity of the program. Because for me, it's easier to stand up a program than it is to maintain one for 3, 5, 10 years.
Yeah, typically a really effective way that we've tracked these in some teams is when we do the information risk council meetings. You'll kind of silo that meeting or structure it into subject matter areas like, say, enterprise security, DevOps, legal, compliance initiatives, and then we'll just develop KPIs in there and we're reporting on the KPIs. A lot of times the KPIs will be tied to those recurring activities. And the KPI is essentially the outcome of the activity. So if it's access reviews, number one, did the access reviews happen? But number two, how many did we miss, if any? How many did our system, our offboarding process miss, and we had to go manually remove after the fact? That's a KPI.
Those measurables are very important. I love sitting in on your IRC meetings because we'll have executives in there. Like, you have the CEO in there, you have the CTO. And I think the very first time we ever have these meetings, they're kind of like, all right, here we go. It's going to be a big discussion. And then you pull that up and you're like, boom, here's the stats, the numbers, the measurables. And they walk away like either feeling really confident about the program because they're like, man, I have a beat on this, or they're narrowed in on the areas they got to improve. All right, we missed this and this, we got to get that. they know who to go talk to make that happen. And if you're not doing that, it's almost just anecdotal at that point. It's all storytelling and, you're flying by the seat of your pants. So I like that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about proof of compliance. So at this point, you're getting audits, right? You're probably getting SOC 2. There's high trust out there. If you're payments, you're doing PCI. SOC 2 is big, ISO certifications. You're probably doing a HIPAA training, probably getting a HIPAA risk assessment. So can you talk about like that body of work and how that impacts companies?
Yeah, this is usually a lot of organizations' least favorite part of the process because it can get expensive and burdensome. We really like to unify it, have a unified program, and this is where, again, I keep talking about ISO 27001, but I really like it for this because it covers 90% of everything. And so this is where you just have your internal framework, your internal control framework, and then we're just mapping out to whatever compliance requirement that we need to adhere to, and tailoring it to meet those audit needs. And with the exception of PCI, it works pretty darn well. PCI is just a little bit different because it can be hyper focused on like one system. And it'll get super technical on that one system. But even there's a lot of overlap even with PCI that you can leverage from that unified program.
Yeah, and I guess for folks that aren't familiar with Risk 360, so I guess from our perspective, how we're thinking about this, because we are an audit firm, right? We do PCI, we do SOC 2, we do high trust, but we also have that vCISO practice that you lead. So we're seeing it from both sides of the table. Sometimes we're the auditor doing the audit, and sometimes our team's the guys managing that audit from the internal perspective. So I think that's a unique perspective, like you're saying. So that's why we're always thinking about unified compliance, especially if you're a healthcare company, because you're probably dealing with SOC 2, probably dealing with high trust. A lot of companies are asking for that, probably dealing with HIPAA for sure. And instead of playing whack-a-mole with all of those frameworks, coming up with one framework to rule them all and manage a program, there's a lot of economies of scale to be had there. So that's what you're thinking about. Also engaging the right partner too. So when we're on the vCISO side, going out and finding, great audit firms that are good partners that are familiar with the modern technology stack, know how to audit AWS, are reasonable people. That's an art in itself, just selecting the right partners.
Yeah, having competent auditors is a really big deal. There's nothing that'll put a sour taste in a company's mouth or a team's mouth than having to deal with really hard to work with auditors. Yeah,
if they don't understand your business and things, that can really be a burden. Cool. So that's kind of like, I think, program in a nutshell. All of this is outlined in the white paper. We'll make sure we have a link to that if anyone is interested in that. So let's talk about the cost and benefit. So if I'm at a decision point in my business's life cycle, and I'm trying to say, does it make sense for me to take this on? Absent of the law, of course, if it's HIPAA is regulatory, you got to do it. But absent of that, what's the business case here? If I'm a security person or CEO, and I just want to know, is there ROI on me building out a security and compliance program? Like what's some of the stuff that you'd be thinking of, Shane?
I think it's making sure that you leverage it to your benefit. And I've noticed this has started becoming a tagline in LinkedIn and email spam I get. Leverage your security and compliance program to be a competitive advantage. But it's actually true if done right. So, what do you think is the best way to tackle this? Because on one hand, we're saying, am I in compliance with contracts and law? Can I afford it? Can I not afford it? Are sales hindered? I think you can think of those from two spheres. Number one, you got to find the right partner to help you work through the contracts and the legal part. Definitely. I wouldn't.
I guess I kind of think of it as an upside and downside too. It's like the downside is I get litigated against, and my business goes out of business because HHS or someone tries to sue me out of existence. So that's a pretty big downside. So I want to manage that. And then there's also the upside. It's like I can go to market with a lot of confidence with a SOC 2 report, with a vendor transparency report, with a really strong story that my competitors might not have, or maybe customers that would not have otherwise considered me are now considering me because I have such a strong story to tell. So I think about both of those. Like, how do I minimize my downside, maximize my upside, and not bankrupt my company in the process. So
Yeah.
there's a careful balance there.
Yeah, I would say make sure that that your compliance and security story is just in line with revenue, and that this is also where having that GRC, the IRC, the Information Risk Council, be cross-functional.
Yeah, because you have your CFO at the table.
If you start pulling in people from the business and talk to customers, talk with outsiders, they're going to be educated on it to actually speak to it. And some of these certifications actually arm the sales force. You know, like you'll have some of them ask for it, and you just got to do that cost benefit analysis, because some of them are really expensive, but there is a certain caliber or size of customer that just won't do business with you unless you have some.
They'll write into the contract, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I always think about it like, there's the law. Like, you have to comply with the law. Like, I would never advise necessarily against not being in compliance with the law, because you got to do that. And then there's kind of like the extra stuff. There's the business to business world where the company says, hey, I want to see you have a SOC 2 report. Like, this makes me feel good to do business with you. And that's when you have the, I guess, the leeway as a business owner to decide, does that make sense for me? And that's when I start asking myself, are they preventing sales? Am I on a timeline? Did someone say, hey, I'm not going to sign this piece of paper until you give me a SOC 2 report or a HITRUST or whatever that is? Yeah. And then you got to think, hey, it's going to cost me X amount to get a report, and this contract and future contracts are worth this amount. So that's when you start thinking about, can I afford it? Can I not afford it? What's the future of the business? Is this a like to have? Is this a have to have? So those are some of the things I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
Cool. So I guess people want to know how to get more information. I guess, emails on the slide here. Shane's our director. He leads our vCISO practice. So if you're, want some input about how to build a great program, how to manage a program, Shane's a great resource for that. He's the author of this white paper. I'll take some credit for editing it, but you're the brainchild behind it. I'm the managing director, co-founder of Risk360. I guess I have the luxury of seeing both sides of the business as well, as the auditor and also as standing up a program. So you guys are welcome to contact us. We also have a few helpful links here that we'll embed in the comments or whatever of however we share this video. But we have a lot of white papers on all the different compliance regulations, everything from HIPAA to GDPR to SOC 2 reports, and you have one coming out talk about how to embed security in DevOps. We also have blog posts that you can search, and then we also have the link to the HHS resources, because they have some checklists and some resources about how to become compliant with HIPAA. So that's kind of our talk, and that's some resources that you guys can have, and make sure you grab that white paper and listen to our next series and webinars. Shane, anything you want to say to wrap it up, or any last closing thoughts?
No, thanks for listening and bearing with us through our first webinar.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.